Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel moderator, Bhavya Lal, to the stage.
Caught me chatting.
Good afternoon. My name is Bhavya Lal. I was the former Associate Administrator for Technology Policy and Strategy at NASA. I am excited to chair this panel on the topic of orbital sustainability, its paradoxes. The question being, there's lots of debris. Where are the economic incentives? We have an amazing panel for you to discuss some of these questions. Let me introduce them to you. I start with my immediate left, John Guiney, who is the Senior Vice President for Network Operations at OneWeb. Then we have Trevor Bennett, who is the co-founder of Starfish Space. And we have David Buckley-Biggs, who has the coolest title I've heard in a while, Head of Future Programs at Stoke Space. So welcome, panelists. And let me just quickly lay some outline. So it's just so we're all level set. What is debris? Debris is any human-created object in space that no longer serves any intended purpose. For the sake of this discussion, we will focus on derelict satellites. What are very large constellations? I will not answer the question, but when John goes first, I will make sure that let's start with the definition there. So at the heart of this discussion is economic incentives. And again, space is not that special. I mean, of course, we all think it's special, but in other domains, debris would be considered amongst policy nerds a negative externality. And oftentimes, negative externalities are addressed through economic incentives. For example, in the environmental domain, governments have used pricing, for example, tariffs for water. They've used taxes and charges. They've used subsidies. And there's this concept that I'm sure you know of tradable permits. You can do something bad in exchange for a fee. There are voluntary agreements and risk management schemes, such as insurance or liability. So there's a waterfront of tools that can be used. What ought to be the incentives for making space safe to operate spacecraft? Are there lessons from these other domains? So let's get to it, and I want to start posing the questions of our experts. So the first one is, and again, just so the audience gets to know you, can you just say a few words on who you are, what you do, what your company does, maybe 60 to 90 seconds?
Sure, I'll start.
John?
So John Guiney, I work for the company called Eutelsat Group. It used to be called OneWeb up until about a month ago as we merged with Eutelsat. I probably now refer to our constellation as the Eutelsat LEO constellation. I've been at that company now for 8.5 years. I started almost from the very beginning of the OneWeb idea. I run the Satellite and Network Operations Center, or network group. So anything that it has to do with our service, either on satellites or on the ground network, is my responsibility. So I get the calls when things don't work as well. That's my story. Thank you.
It's a good story. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Trevor.
Yeah, excellent. My name's Trevor. I'm one of the two co-founders of a company called Starfish Space. We are a Seattle-based satellite servicing, life extension, and satellite removal company. Founded with the premise of let's go and build the core technologies, both software and hardware, to grab and move other satellites around. And with a variety of desired use cases, those being helping constellations keep their orbits clear, those being keeping satellites in operation for longer than they would have otherwise been in operation, so kind of the life extension side. And then lastly, really unlocking a whole new set of missions that we get excited about. And it's part of the reason why this panel is interesting to me, is because it kind of spans not just where we are, but where we're going. And the ability to bring things back to Earth or have a more consistent life cycle for spacecraft speed the iteration up and actually build on top of it. Maybe we're actually building satellites in orbit or building space stations and a variety of interesting things. So that's a little bit of why we founded Starfish and hopefully where we go from here.
That is so exciting, and I think it's one of the coolest lines of business, so hope to learn more. David.
Okay, very cool. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is David Buckley-Biggs. I work for Stoke Space, also in the Seattle area, and we are building fully and rapidly reusable rockets. We started with the second stage, the stage that everyone else throws away, and we kind of have a unique concept where the base of the vehicle is cooled by liquid hydrogen. That's also our rocket propellant in space. We started development with that vehicle, and we just performed a hop. If you haven't seen it, come talk to me or look us up on YouTube for Stoke Space hop. We performed and I think it's a great 30-second watch. As part of this discussion, we like to support how can we both rapidly and reasonably launch satellites into orbit and then bring satellites or other objects back from orbit, and how can we promote useful and sustainable space.
Excellent. Okay, so this is the panel. I have about 4 or 5 questions. I really would like it to be an interactive session. There is a sufficiently small number of you that I think we can get everyone's questions in. So go to, I think it's Micro 53. Go to the website and please start sending questions. And as you are thinking about them, I'm going to throw the first one. As you know, I worked at NASA. The OTPS office that I led did a lot of work in space sustainability, including cost-benefit analysis of things like active debris remediation. So I definitely am coming from a government perspective, although I understand how incredibly critical the role of the commercial sector is here. With that, actually, I'm going to ask each of you, but maybe Trevor, you can start. What do you see as the role of government in creating incentives in orbital sustainability? Who pays, how? I mean, we know that, FCC, for example, a few years ago, they fined this company called Swarm Space for, adverse behavior in space. They recently fined another company for, inappropriate post-mission disposal. So we have something that is done, but maybe there's other incentives. What would you say those incentives are?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer and it has a lot of breadth. So maybe we'll start at a few places and see where the conversation takes us.
I want this to be a super substantive discussion.
Yeah, great,
so get
great.
into it.
Yeah, awesome. So I think for Starfish, we founded on the premise that space is an ecosystem. And I think that's part of the reason why we're excited by everybody up here too, is because we think about space as an ecosystem. And that means it's not just about getting part of the mission done. It's how do we actually make sure that we can do future missions or future business or future exploration in space. The role of government is an interesting one in that they have often led the charge for a long period of time, in the US in particular, and now globally we're seeing a lot more nation states enter space. The challenge is now a transition of how do we change the policy language over to actually let companies such as ours do more ambitious missions? How do we facilitate, in our case, and let's give a more concrete example then, right? Starfish is building an Otter spacecraft that can autonomously rendezvous and dock with another spacecraft in orbit. And for example, let's say we're going to go help Eutelsat OneWeb now to go grab one of their satellites that, for whatever reason, has reached the end of the life, and we would like to get it out of the way so they can keep operating.
For example.
For example, right? Exactly. As we fly and do that mission, there are a number of things that we have to get right along the way. There is, one, there has to be an incentive for John and his company to even engage with us, right? They have to see a reason why it's worth paying Starfish to go do this thing. Then we both have to have a license to be able to accomplish that mission. We have to go and seek approval that 2 objects can actually dock in space, right? And then from there, we actually have to be able to communicate with our spacecraft the whole time. We have to make sure that our frequencies are not conflicting with each other or not conflicting with some other operation that was originally scoped for that location. And all that thing is, our operation is dynamic. We're coming around Earth in a variety of different ways. We're not a static entity anymore. And then let's say we want to bring it back down, right? There are maybe options like putting it in the second stage of a rocket and bringing it back down that way. There's burning it up in the atmosphere, which has its own complexities as part of it. or there's bringing it up to another orbit where we could do recycling. But then that invokes salvage laws, or how do we actually own or use satellites that are already up there? And so those are all the complexities on that front. Where government can engage, even on a financial perspective, is that we're a little bit of a chicken and egg problem that we're trying to solve, right? We're trying to develop technology, like the actual spacecraft, Otter, to go do these missions. And others are trying to look at, okay, well, you're not quite, we haven't seen this fly time and time again yet, so how do we design that in to believe that it can be there and ready? Sometimes having a government customer come in and say, we know that this is right there. If we can prove this once or twice, then everybody can start building on top of that. That's a great way to inject, because it helps stimulate that whole new market. Another way to inject into the process is to provide less burden in other ways too, right? That there's an opportunity to say, okay, licensing becomes easier or more fluid because you're trying to do these sustainable actions. And there's, just like electric cars got a boost to go do these things, companies who are going through a process and trying to embrace that can get a boost in some way or another. And then maybe the last way to kind of think through the financing aspect is providing a structure. Sometimes it's penalties against it, but the penalties have to be sufficiently high to actually invoke change. Right. And there's kind of a question is like, yes, there is huge steps taken to actually invoke a penalty for the first time in some of these recent actions, but was it sufficiently high to actually make a change happen? Because somebody might still be able to do the math and say, well, it cost me this much to pay the penalty, and I save this much time. That's why people speed on the road, right? They're always playing this game, like, yeah, the ticket's gonna be $100, but I'm saving 5 or 10 minutes every day, so we'll see how it all comes out. So it's like, how does the course of business actually get changed by the policy? A little bit more long-winded there.
Right. No, that's great. And I think this very last point you made kind of also shows that government needs to be savvy with respect to doing some of those models and calculations to know what the fine has to be that it's fair. So, no, I completely agree. David and John, do you want to add anything to the economic incentives? I think we heard about upfront investment. We heard about reducing regulatory burdens. We heard about penalties, but in a way that actually it incentivizes correct behavior. Anything else?
Well, I would just say I certainly don't want OneWeb or us to finance things by penalties, right? I bet those other two companies wish they hadn't done what they had done, right? Because it's not just monetary, it's also reputational, right?
Naming and shaming, yes.
Right. So I mean, I know that one of the things that we've talked about, advocated for, is almost for some of the servicing missions is almost like a AAA service where you subscribe to the service whether you need it or not, but when you need it you can call Trevor and he'll come pick us up.
That's right.
And so I mean, honestly, that and the other way maybe we could do it is through tax incentives, right? Things like that are not necessarily paying people to do things, but if they are successful and they do something well, then potentially tax benefits to the tax rebates or tax incentives for the companies.
Which are tools the government uses in all other domains. And I think one of the points I make, and I made one in the session I was in earlier, is we think space is special, and maybe it is, but we need to start to normalize space, and I think one way to normalize it to treat it as a different sector. John, do you have anything? David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to, I think in your initial discussions, you mentioned looking at other domains and how we can learn from there and bring it back. And this talking about negative externalities, I think another like colloquial way of saying that is like tragedy of the commons, right? And I was quickly Googling this morning, and people have been looking at this or debating this for millennia, right? I mean, more recently in papers, so going back to like Aristotle, I read, and more recently people looking at pasture in Great Britain and how shared pasture, and you put cattle on there, for an individual, we call them ranchers, they call them farmers. For an individual farmer, it makes sense to put an additional cattle on the land, but as everyone does that, then you deplete the resource that you're shared with. And then I was thinking about what are the solutions that people have come up with for the tragedy of the commons, and there's kind of three, and one, we're talking a lot about regulation, right? But then there's also cooperation, and then there's ownership. And I think we kind of need some of each in order to have a holistic solution that not only encompasses local, United States regulation, but then also global. And so I think that's in getting into each one a little bit more. So in terms of regulation, I think we have made strides forward, right, with like we talked about the fines and with FCC and maybe DOC taking over some of that. But I don't know how that extends to what other nations do. And so at the very least, we need cooperation with other nations to extend that. And then the third one that I think is very interesting is this idea of ownership. So already, right, the ITU works with countries and the different regions to license spectrum. And I had this idea of, well, why can't we do that with orbits, right? And the benefit there, that going back to the cattle and pasture, is that people have seen, and there's studies on this, that when there's private land, that people have a stronger sense of stewardship and investment to maintain that, and maybe even drive even further innovation. And so I think it gets tricky in orbit because now you have, say we're just talking about sun-synchronous orbits, you still intersect, right? And so you have to cooperate on those intersection points. But overall, I think it's a way of saying, maybe Eutelsat owns, their orbit, and they're incentivized to work with Starfish and hopefully Stoke on maintaining that.
Right. You've clearly mastered the literature and tragedy of the commons. I can tell from the language you're using. So Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize for laying out a lot of the theory behind this, and I think it's really important for us to learn from what's happening in other parts. I really would like you all to send questions, and I'm seeing them come in, so that's fantastic. Actually, wait, let me stop my question and ask this one, since it relates to the topic we just had. The question is, and again, any of you can pick it up. What about bonds as an alternative financial tool to penalties? Maybe John, you want to start, and then if others want to jump in.
I mean, I guess that sounds okay. I guess I'd have to understand a little bit more about what that is. But I mean, again, I just think if anyone is relying on penalties to fund things, then we aren't really doing the right. Community's not doing their job and try to clean things up, right? I mean, I think it should be much better to have people want to cooperate and want to do things the right way instead of worry about, did I get a penalty or not? So.
Right, I think they're talking about bonds, and I think bonds is something, you pay up front and you get it back sort of thing, right? Isn't that?
Sure, that'd be a great idea too. I mean, there's a lot of good ideas out there. I don't know that anyone has really, really settled on one that makes sense. Again, we kind of think of a AAA service or things, but a bond service would be great, almost like a recycling thing you do. I don't know if there's states that still do cash back on your recycling, right? So.
Oh yeah, and I mean, when you check into a hotel, like at the link, I had to pay all this money in case I raid the minibar, right? So I get that money back. So it's an incentive that I won't raid the minibar.
Well, you should have definitely used the minibar. Come on.
Maybe I have 2 points on that. One, even the title of this is we should be finding economic incentives that are not just driven from a government perspective, right? That part of the reason why we are working together as an industry and even as individual companies up here is to try and find ways to make it viable for all of us without that extra pressure, right? Even if we want to use the hotel example, like you still have a desire to travel and go, and you're not being penalized by a government entity for your use of the area, but you have a relationship there that makes sense for both of you. Hopefully that's true for us too. And that's really what we're trying to seek out in all of this. Similarly with like bonds and the aspect there's always a trade-off, right? Bonds might feel really natural and exciting from perspective, well, the companies that are using are paying into that, and then there's some payback, but that's also more upfront capital, right? So if we think about what could hinder innovation in that case, there's maybe an additional charge there just to get the first one up there, or the learning that happens in that early stage. There's also a different amount of trading that might happen. As soon as you have bonds on orbit, is there a whole nother paradigm that emerges that people are starting to take bets against how the orbital environment is going to evolve? And maybe do we have some conflicting incentives there? So these ideas are good ones. Let's keep them flowing, but it's not just going to be a silver bullet in many of these cases. I think there has to be a combination of the companies themselves come together and find a solution. And then similarly, we can augment that or support that by the environment that we're all trying to operate in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we keep looking for silver bullets, and there isn't one. So I actually will keep going with these questions because these are way better than the questions I had. So this question's for you, John. Can you explain the economic incentive for a large constellation operator to pay for debris removal?
Well, so one of the things you asked me is what's a large constellation, right?
Yes.
We really don't like to use the word mega constellation for many reasons. I always think of something out of a James Bond movie, you know, the mega constellation that is going to rule the world, right? So we definitely use large constellations. I don't actually know that there's a real definition for it. It's probably more than 100 satellites. Is it 500? Is it 400? I don't know. We're at 630, you know, 634. Probably qualify as a large constellation, but maybe some of our, you know, Kuiper and SpaceX would say I'm pretty small in comparison. So, and again, so the question is, what's the incentive? For us, I think from the very beginning of OneWeb, we have tried to act as responsibly as possible in space. And so I think it's our duty to not clutter up space. I mean, we actually, in our spacecraft design, we have docking modules and magnetic plates that we've installed on every one of our satellites. In case that satellite becomes a derelict satellite, there'll be an opportunity for companies to come grab that satellite and bring it down. And did we have to do that? Absolutely not. And in the end, when you multiply the cost of that fixture times, you know, 700 satellites, it was something that we paid for. But I mean, I think we thought we did it for the right reasons, right? To keep space safe and clean and something that other people can use.
I might append onto it real quick and say one of the conversations we've had was, if you have a number of conjunction events, right? If you have a collision, that's actually a knock-on effect that could be prohibitive to just your normal case of business. And so there is always going to be this tipping point where once we're dense enough, or once our operations are crossing over enough, that one derelict spacecraft could jeopardize a whole shell or a whole orbit, then it's worth considering how much is that shell worth? What are the probabilities that this collision actually becomes worse? I also want to kind of branch us a little bit in a different direction too, which is even just with Stoke and being able to bring down objects from space. We, as part of thinking about the life cycle of a satellite, wouldn't it be great to look at why the satellite died? Or see how the materials survived over the course of the operation? And the ability to go grab it and move it down, put it in the second stage, let that second stage come back down. I mean, that could be actually closing a life cycle that we benefit from in so many other industries, right? We can look at a car after many years of operation. We can look at our phones after years of operation and kind of help close that design. Some of those things start to be enabled when we allow these technologies to work together. And those incentives are not necessarily obvious in that one spacecraft being pulled down was worth that money, but maybe the learning that comes from it is. Maybe the avoidance of a collision is worth it.
Yeah, I actually want to pull on that thread a little bit and ask both John and David, how have you integrated, if at all, satellite servicing capabilities in your business plans, or you know?
David, you
Sure.
want to take it?
Thank you. And also thank you so much for teeing that up. I love it. I think it's fascinating to start to think about a world where we have daily flights to and from orbit. And when the cost of launch is not as large of a driving factor in the satellite's cost. And I think you start to do things and plan things differently than you do today. And whether you're conducting experiments on orbit or if you're bringing back satellites and refurbishing them, these sorts of things, they seem crazy today, but I think once we get to what we think is the inevitable end state of fully and rapidly reusable rockets, I think we can start to see that. And that's been our vision, and I think a lot of this is we play a supporting role there in helping people, launch constellations and maintain them. And then even servicer vehicles, right? LEO, it's on the one hand, it's very close to Earth, but on the other hand, it's absolutely massive, right? And getting from one plane to another plane is a huge expenditure of propellant and time. And so one thing that we started looking at is, hey, instead, if a servicer needs to go multiple destinations, it might actually be faster to grab it, bring it back to the ground, even top it up with propellant, maybe replace some avionics, and then relaunch it into a new orbit. And that's not something, I don't think I'm hearing anybody else talk about today, but I hope it becomes something that we are talking about.
Yeah.
I think that's spectacular. In fact, one of the things, I've been doing this for a while, and one of the things I hear so much more now than I did before is some of these new ideas. I think, folks need to hear them and we need to start building it. I mean, 5 years ago, if we talked about ISAM, people just looked at you funny. Now
did.
it's real. Now people are thinking about, well, how do we make it happen? So I think we've made a lot of progress. We need to obviously make a lot more. John, do you want to add anything to that? How does satellite servicing fit into your business?
Well, again, I don't think so much satellite servicing, right? I mean, our satellites are not designed necessarily to be serviced on orbit right now. We're actively building or actively designing our Gen 2 system, and I'm not sure that we have anything like that. But certainly from a servicing point of view, when that means bringing a satellite back down, absolutely. We've already put that in our Gen 1 design, and we'll have something like that in our Gen 2 design.
Cool. Moving on, one question got a ton of upvotes, so I have to ask. How should recycling or salvaging work in regard to property rights? So there's a lot going on in this question. So, good question. I don't know, whoever of you wants to take it.
I may see the discussion and say, I don't know, because the Outer Space Treaty is probably one of the best reference documents we have in space domain. And then sea salvage rights, ocean salvage rights, is probably the other one that we have from another market to think through and use. The Outer Space Treaty often has a lot of language that can be pitfalls to the salvaging mission, because it defines, as at a time when it was only nation states launching vehicles, as the assumption baked in. And when you assume that only a nation state has an interest in there or doesn't have the technology to even go grab other satellites, it's not even thought of, it's not even implemented, but it could be prohibitively written in inadvertently. That's a little bit of the case. Would love to see salvage rights. I'd love to be, I don't want to call it a space pirate, but at least a space salvager where we can go around and grab old objects that could be threatening other satellites, but also could just be at the end of their life and still have valuable materials. We did a calculation at the start of Starfish where we looked at all the mass that was launched into orbit, human-made objects. It was over 8 million kilograms of mass. And we also did the calculation in 2019 launch dollars, and that was over $40 billion in launch. And so even recovering a small percentage of that, you start to wonder, like, is it really? And that's just the mass alone. That's not the high-grade material that went into it. That's not potentially the viability of the system still. Maybe the solar panels are still good. You could do a lot of crazy things if you already have it in orbit and you just top it off or fix something up and try and experiment with it. So that's a little bit more hopeful thinking and wishful thinking than anything else.
It's really important. So just earlier this summer, there was a report from NOAA, and they are starting to see lots of weird heavy metals in the upper atmosphere, hafnium, niobium, and I think they talk about 1,000 metric tons or something of material from deorbiting satellites. So yes, so doing something like that isn't just a financial incentive to do that, but also maybe it reduces some polluting activities back in our biosphere. My next question is a little big picture, but then from the audience there are some very specific questions. So I'll start with the big picture, and then we can address the audience questions which are more in the which are more detailed. So the question is, as you know, all regulations have a mixed reputation. Some believe that they cause better behavior and most cost, spur innovation, right? I mean, you can do interesting new things. Seat belts or I think airbags are an example of something that came out of regulation. But others believe they slow down innovation. So your thoughts sort of at the highest level, and then we can drill down a little bit more into specifics. So what are your thoughts?
So I can start?
Yeah, start with David.
I guess just the first the earlier topic, I think regulation is important, but we need cooperation with the whole international community around this. And in I lost my train of thought. And so it's really not just I guess as Trevor said it well earlier too, if we over-regulate ourselves, it's only stifling our own innovation and allowing others to come in. And I think at the same time, it is a global issue of where, if we create a catastrophe in orbit, that impacts everyone. And so I think we have to take a larger view of this and work with everyone, not only to, as we're doing, prevent collisions in space, but also deter conflict, right? Anything we can do in terms of diplomacy and deterrence to conflict, I think will be huge in terms of preventing space from becoming unusable.
Agreed. Any other thoughts?
I'll take one. And you know, regulation. I'm not crazy about some regulation, right? But I was just thinking, you know, there was a very well published, maybe inaccurately published, story about OneWeb and Starlink having a very dangerous or very near collision a couple of years ago. And had the government stepped in at that point and mandated or tried to regulate how OneWeb and Starlink were going to interact with each other in that domain, that could have really stifled a lot of the innovation, right? They have a system that they've innovated and they do autonomous collision on orbit. We have a system where we're doing automatic and autonomous conjunction assessment and maneuver planning on the ground. And we've each arrived at a system, and when we now have any conjunction between OneWeb and Starlink, it's autonomous, right?
And you guys are talking back and forth all the time.
Well, and most times we don't have to talk because we've agreed how we're going to behave.
Your machines are talking.
Well, or we've agreed how we're going to behave, and we behave that way. And there's occasion when we have to talk to one another, but it's a low drama event when we do it, and it's certainly we tried to bring the temperature down a little bit on some of that debate. But I mean, I can't imagine if the government had said that's very dangerous, you should do it this way. It really might have been able to really stifled the solutions we came up with.
Yeah, that's great. I may just cap it and just say it comes down to intent, I think, in all of these cases, right? Regulation is just a proxy for intent. And so if we can do a good job expressing what is our intent, why are we trying to keep orbits clear? Why are we trying to make sure that multiple nations can go to space or that we can use it for a variety of interesting and peaceful operations? Then the regulation should follow from that, or the implementations that we as companies go after can follow from it. There always feels like this dirty relationship between companies and regulation, right? Like, wow, we don't want to be regulated because we want to go do our thing and innovate, and we use innovation sometimes as a cover for, well, this is just in our financial best interest. But in many cases, if we just say like the best goal of space is, and tragedy the commons can play into it, there are times when if we just express, rather than saying every spacecraft needs to be able to completely deorbit itself in a failure case, and we instead say, make sure that spacecraft are cleaned up after end of life, that's really what we care about, is the intent there. Because we don't drive around with cars with two engines in it, or we don't have this big panic attack when we have a flat tire. What we do is we've built other industries around supporting those cases. We have tow trucks, we have AAA, we have all these other pieces that come into place. And so really I think the challenge with regulation and the challenge for us as companies is to just communicate what our intents are and communicate why we're going after those paths. And hopefully at the end of the day, those converge really nicely.
Yeah, those are some great ideas. Trevor, both you and David talked about some international collaborations, international thinking. So one question from the audience, a really good one, is how can we get global agreement in space when we can't even get agreement on global climate change? What is the incentive to participate? I think I know the answer, but I think yours is going to be better.
I love that. I think there's a lot of parallels there that we could talk about. And actually, I want to second two things Trevor just said. I think in international cooperation, two of the main things we could get out of it, at least at the start, are unified set of goals and transparency and through open dialogue. I don't know what those goals should be today, but I just know that having that roundtable and having that dialogue is the first step.
Right, especially countries where we don't typically have strong relationships like China or Russia.
Right. I hope it's not. I hope it's not a bad event that drives this. Right. Like there's a very real case where it's a destructive collision or a conflict that breaks out that makes us all realize that we're a little bit more on a balance than we thought we were. And so my hope is that's not the case. But historically, humans have been a reactive species, not a proactive species in some of these things. And so really, maybe part of the reason why we're having this conversation around economic incentives, there are ways that we can align with the rest of the world, right? If it is you want to regularly launch to space, let's find ways to say, yeah, you can go to space regularly, but so does your partner here. So for all of us, for everybody's sake, this is what our expectation is at the end, or this is what our expectation is while you're continuing to fly and you're flying close passes next to somebody else. Here's some examples of how to do it well. And maybe that's part of what the conversation can evolve into is we are trying to drive this because we see both an internal passion to go after and build connectivity or build regular launch or be able to keep orbits clear and to build on top of that as infrastructure. We can help show that it's possible in a way that others can build on top of. And maybe sometimes setting the example is the way to build that international cooperation. There will always be complications in that. Things like ITAR, right, is something that can plague an aerospace industry in particular that you don't see hamstring many other industries. The way we get around that, again, is finding good civil space opportunities or finding good cross-border opportunities to work together. Notably, we have a spacecraft in orbit right now that pulls a thruster from France, for instance, or we, a company now that spans multiple continents, right? Like these are the things that we can do to actually to show that the international community is involved and engaged.
Right. So as a company that spans multiple continents, my next question's for you, John. And again, really great questions, people. Thank you. How do we ensure that the burden of cleaning up debris is fairly distributed amongst countries and companies, considering the economic factors involved? John, if you wanted to take a crack at it, and then others can jump in.
Again, I don't know how you levy bonds, incentives, things like that. I mean, I think from just a numbers point of view, it probably makes a bit more sense for a large constellation to do more or pay more or for the ability to clean space based on the number of satellites we have. Right? Again, for us, cooperating and doing things like that is just good business, right? I mean, we ended up using SpaceX to launch some of our satellites, and I think some people thought that was a bit crazy. But it's in both of our economic interests to do that, right? So I mean, I think I think it would be unfair if we had a single satellite operator that they were going to pay as much or share the same amount of incentive or tax or whatever you want to say that we as a corporation do. But I mean, again, I hope we get to the point where all these companies want to do things and we don't need the penalties or we don't need the things like that. We just do it because it makes sense for us.
Right. Yeah. One more international question before I switch.
I had to quickly look
should there be an international FAA-like entity or agreement to incentivize and enforce orbital debris best practices? Trevor, and then if you want.
Yeah, I was just actually quickly Googling because I was interacting with an economics major in grad school because we were trying to pose the same question, like how do you actually build a space economy? Like who actually cares, right? And one of the things that he brought up, and I believe it was like the Montreal Protocol, he would claim was the only successful piece of legislation for climate ever. And I'll have to check me on this.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So this is one of those things that stands out, and it was a structure that allowed a staged approach of adoption. It also allowed a disparity for countries based off of where they were, right, in the process and things. And so there is an interesting balance there. For those that are not familiar, it's probably worth a quick look. And I am not enough of an expert to inform you properly, so I do encourage you to go look it up. But those are the types of precedents that we can turn to in this time. And somebody who is far more capable in the policy aspect than I am could probably speak better to it.
Yeah, no, there's actually case studies on that. Why did Montreal Protocol, which was about ozone agreement around ozone layer and not emitting things like chlorofluorocarbons, and there's a question around why did that work and how can what are the lessons for other areas? And again, I'm not an expert either, but one thing I remember reading was it was really clear there was a problem. And it was going to cost us human lives. It was going to have actual downsides. And I think, that's a kind of analysis we need to bring in this domain. So there's no doubt left that this is a problem that needs addressing, and here's a number.
Maybe I can speak candidly. Sorry, one more point on that, is that for us, we always have a challenge, and I think this is true for space in general. we have a communication challenge, right? We do complex things, and then we try to simplify it. Like for us, we're grabbing another spacecraft in orbit traveling at 7 kilometers per second, and we say, oh, we're a space tow truck. It's like, it's an oversimplification that loses a lot of the nuance and behaviors that we're actually trying to accomplish. I think that's true even in this policy realm too, right? We think about what is affecting climate change, for instance, and we can say, well, a couple degrees Celsius is gonna be a big deal. But that doesn't mean anything if you're not aware of the implications of a temperature change, or you're not aware of how fast 7 kilometers per second actually is. And so I think if policy is going to take a meaningful step forward, and maybe us as a community, it's a challenge for us to say, how do we map it to something that is tangible? How do we map it to something that can be meaningful? You know, having reusable rockets and being able to say this ozone depletion is a real problem. But it still traces to another few degrees Celsius. So then what's the knock-on effect of that? Well, watching more dramatic hurricanes hit, or additional fires plague, you know, towns that historically have not seen such destruction. That's where we can start to link some of the behaviors that we're trying to do in space, and maybe even answer the hardest question of all, like, why are we working in space instead of here on Earth, right? And so maybe that's a point to draw for ourselves in a call to action for the community.
Not the right amount of simplifying. You want to connect with the audience and have them understand without oversimplifying. And I remember trying to do it with SSA many years ago. You know, we started using words like data lake, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's easy, but it isn't, so then we stopped. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I want to ask some questions around, wow, there's really great questions, and I'm going to send it all to you for you to kind of think about them. How about debris smaller than, is any one of you actively working solutions for small debris less than 10 centimeters? And do you believe solutions are needed for these sizes?
That's a hard one. How much smaller than 10 centimeters, right? I mean, it's...
Yeah. I think the answer is no for us, and it's a sad no, but you know, it comes back to the question, who's going to pay for it? I mean, maybe this is a modeling question where we can actually understand the knock-on effects of having these small debris impact our satellites. There are plenty of images of where a small piece of paint puts a bullet hole-shaped deformation into a surface material. But at the end of the day, for us, our meaningful step is not going and grabbing or tracking those. Our meaningful step is going and removing the satellites before they become those pieces. And we'll have to take that step from a financial perspective first. From a company effort, maybe there are ways to partner around that elsewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just second that point too. We can, if we remove the input of what's driving the creation of those objects, then I think that's the best we can do for now.
And the next question actually is asking that same question in a different way. Do you think a better understanding of the costs and risks posed by debris, and again, presumably of all sizes, would be sufficient to motivate action? So I guess for this question, maybe not just stick with small debris, but the range of debris would have a better understanding of costs and benefits, or costs and risks help.
I mean, we based a lot of our design of our ground system and our software on being able to autonomously, you know, avoid debris, right? We've invested a lot of time, money, and effort into making sure we have a very robust system to counteract all the debris that is you know, we get collision data messages on. So yeah, we've put a lot of effort into making sure we can avoid that stuff.
Maybe succinctly, more data helps us make decisions. The right data helps us make the right decisions. And so, yeah, if people can contribute to that conversation, I think it's really useful.
Hey, just some shameless self-promotion. A few months ago, NASA came out with a report where it did analysis of costs and risks and benefits of a range of active debris remediation technologies. I hope you all have seen that report, and I hope it was helpful. And I know that work has continued, so I hope you will be able to follow on with it. And again, NASA is taking this issue pretty seriously, and there's a lot of work coming out of NASA. With just a minute left, I have a lightning round. If you were ruler of the day of all things space, what would be the first thing you do fast?
Trevor's not going to like it. I would instantly remove all human-made debris in space of any size.
That's some impressive power.
Well, I mean, if I could,
Hey,
if
yeah,
I,
if you could
if
do
I
anything,
was,
that's
if
great.
I, you know,
Yeah.
if I was ruler for the day, that's
No,
what
that's
I'd
great.
do.
That's great.
That's great.
Yeah, really with magic powers. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I were ruler for the day, I would say throw a bunch of money at new ideas. I think that there's a coalescing of some pretty impressive stuff if we just had a little bit more funding and kind of this mid-tier around how the ideas actually get to orbit.
I think I would start a new international consortium or collaboration where we bring in people to figure out this problem together, set goals, be transparent, avoid conflict, that sort of thing.
That's fantastic.
What about you?
Oh God, I know I wasn't prepared for that. But if I had to say, I would say we need better data. We need the right data. That's what I would do. I would really put data on the problem and showcase sort of the Montreal Protocol thing, right? This is the problem. This is the solution. Anyway, we have 0 seconds left. Perfect timing, you all. Thank you so much for coming. Please thank the panel. You all asked great questions. Thanks again.
Bhavya, thank you so much.